I was going to start with Mr. Chabinsky. I'm a member of the Armed Services Committee. In fact, I just came from there, so apologies for being late. I know the military doesn't defend itself from cyber attacks by software alone. You know, they use a system of personnel training and physical security and IT to guard against would-be attackers. Does industry follow that approach, and if not, what percent of risk would investments in enhanced IT hardware and software cover?
Thank you for the question, Congressman Kilmer. Industry does absolutely follow the same approach. That approach is, in fact, developed by NIST and adopted under FISMA. Basically, you're talking about 3 different controls that are put into place under a risk framework. There are technical controls, and much of what this focus of this committee is on the technology. And then we've already heard about the administrative controls, about trying to work with our personnel to ensure effective enforcement of our policies, and then physical controls, making sure people don't actually have access to our servers. Those are exactly the same types of controls that are adopted in private sector standards that are international as well, and that have been rolled out again in a actually quite elegant form in the cybersecurity framework. I would, of course, note that the military systems themselves have been breached on numerous occasions and have not been able to withstand the onslaught of intelligence services, nor have the private sector. So I think everybody is working in a situation in which they're doing the best that they can, following similar standards. But again, we're talking about an area where risk is controlled, but there remains an unfortunately large amount of residual risk in this area.
I was hoping to touch on something that there's been some discussion around already. I was a few months back in a meeting with a number of folks in the IT space, and we were talking about cybersecurity issues. And the conversation found its way to how companies implement protections, invest in new software, and adopt best practices on avoiding cyber attack. And one of the folks in the room said, you know, it's not the government's role to force compliance or force protection. And I asked the question, you know, can government in some way incent good cyber hygiene and incent compliance? Do you think government, as it stands right now, provides any incentive to industry to take steps it should to protect itself? And if so, how? And if not, what might that look like?
So, speaking again from the perspective of the development of the cybersecurity framework that was just released last month, there have been discussions in place with regard to, you know, DHS helping with the voluntary program, and they've rolled out something that they call now C-Cubed, which is their approach to providing assistance in using the framework. But there's always been, in addition to that, discussions about incentives that could be provided from the government, and I think those discussions would be productive going forward as well.
Anything specific? I mean, go ahead, Mr. Vanderhoof.
Thank you, Mr. Kilmer. So you mentioned the Department of Defense, which still today is pretty much the gold standard in terms of protecting its networks and cybersecurity effects. And what they did was they invested in their identity credentials to make those authentication technologies strong as possibly can, so that they know who is allowed to be within their network to help prevent those people that are not allowed to be in the network from getting in the network. And the government has adopted this common standard across the entire Federal enterprise using secure chip technology, and have actually extended that technology standard that was set by NIST to the commercial entities that also do business with government. So what has proven to be very effective on the commercial side has been government leading by example of protecting itself first, extending that level of standard for protection for commercial entities doing business with the government, and then that in turn has stimulated investment in those technologies that are then translated into the commercial space as well.
Thanks.
I'll say that for financial data, I think the law does provide some pretty strong incentives. Data breach notification is incredibly painful and expensive. The PCI rules, I think, put pretty strong incentives there. For other categories of consumer data, though, I think they're actually very poor including a lot of health data, right? To the extent health data is not governed by HIPAA and high tech, to the extent you give information to an app or to some online service, there are very little protections at all security-wise. The Federal Trade Commission has tried to be aggressive with its Consumer Protection Authority, but even when they win, they can't get any money. They just say, okay, promise to use better security in the future. So I think there should be stronger protections for other categories of consumer data.
On the incentive side, Department of Homeland Security is doing good work right now with the insurance industry to determine whether or not corporations will be able to find a better market in insurance to be able to transfer risk. And the insurance industry, as a result, is trying to think of ways that improved security will result in a market that will be both cost-effective and beneficial. So I think that that is one area that the government is working right now on the incentive side. Of course, in a national data breach notification law, should one exist, there is the potential to have certain safe harbors if certain encryption methodologies were placed or otherwise. So I think that there are a number of incentives. Again, my only caution is in any comparison between the private sector and the government with respect to data security and network security, to have a more realistic discussion about the number of breaches that actually are actively being incurred against government systems, with a lot of resources being put against them and mandates, no less, not even voluntary, and yet there still obviously are a lot of issues there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.